Good evening. This is David Hennessy for Faith Matters. My guest today is somebody most of you know, John Connors, the actor, who is also host of the podcast Reclaim the Faith. John's life is a testimony to the mercy of God. John asked Jesus for the grace of serenity and peace, and his prayer was answered. Since that moment, John gave his life to God and decided to spread the news so other people could feel and receive what he and so many of us have received. Well, John, you're very welcome. It's a joy to have you and a joy to know you.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks for having me. Faith Matters is a great name because faith does matter, matters more than anything.
It does, more than anything, John. We didn't know it when we didn't have it.
Exactly.
So, John, could you tell us your story?
Yeah, I'm from London actually, originally, David. I was born in London.
That accent.
I know
Your
this is not a
accent does.
London accent. I suppose my brother slagged me my whole life, the whole Irish English thing. But I moved back to the north side of Dublin, where my family are from. My father's actually from Limerick originally. My mother is from Dublin, but my family's from all around, really. Limerick, Dublin, Wexford and Carlow and Tuam and Longford and West Belfast. So that's kind of the grandparents and parents and all where they're all from. So all around. And we moved back to the north side of Dublin before I was 1 year of age. So it was still 1990. Grew up there in Coolock and a few different sites and had a good childhood for a long time, good parents, I suppose I was born in London because of a kind of crazy set of circumstances. My father, he was a diagnosed schizophrenic. One night he hijacked a taxi while he was engaged to my mother. He would have been about 18, 19. She would have been about 16, 17. And he got put on armed guard in the hospital. And my mother went in to visit him. And it was a long engagement already, probably 2 years. And she didn't want to wait after a prison sentence. So she escaped them out the window and we went on a ferry to London. And that's why I was born in London. So when I got back to Dublin then, or came to Dublin, my father did a prison sentence for the hijacking and he had sort of a rocky road, a rocky journey along the way with his mental health and would have been regularly hospitalized in mental hospitals. We would have visited him, myself and my brother Joe, with my mother. We thought we were visiting him in a karate dojo. And actually, there were good memories. And we used to have great crack, But things kind of got worse along the way. Now, listen, along the way, we got a lot of love from him. He was a very loving father. As was my mother, but he did transform into other people, and there was a few suicide attempts, one of which I found him. And after that attempt, I remember we were living in a flat in the north side of Dublin in Coolock, and we moved back into my family's site where my mother is from and her family. And I suppose the logic was from her point of view is that move back into the culture and get away from the sort of negativity. And her and my father had split and he was sort of in and out of mental hospitals. And when I was 8 years of age, my father came to visit me in the site, but he wasn't his right self. He thought that he was a different person and he was coming in and out of this persona. And he tried to take myself and my brother Joe with him for some sort of trip. And myself and my brother Joe rejected him. And we could see the kind of look at his face. He was really upset. And a few days later, I heard my father call me when I was in the back fields, and I went into my mother and I asked her where daddy is, and she said that he wasn't around, because as far as she knew, he was in a hospital or some sort at the time. But she called me in for dinner and we had stew, and while we were eating, the police came in, the guards came in and told us that he was found dead in a river. He had been probably dead for a few days. So that voice planted a seed in me, David. So even along my whole journey in life and my spiritual journey, my journey of faith, I would have never called myself an atheist. In fact, I would have always argued against atheists. First of all, I didn't think it was logical that something comes from nothing. That actually goes against science. But also because of the spiritual experiences I had along the way, like hearing that voice when I was out in the field of my father calling me, and he had been dead at that time, which I didn't know. So my mother had to rear us on her own, and that was tough for her, but a great mother she was. And myself and my brother Joe got a lot of bullying. We went to school, and in school, after second class, what was traditional that time, in Ireland, in the Irish school system, David, was that Irish traveller kids after second class, after doing their communion, when they go to third class, which is usually the senior school, they'd be put in an all traveller class with third classers, fourth classers, fifth classers, sixth classers all together. So that
Good
it
God.
was sort of when they stopped educating you, and they just put you all in the same
That is
pool, consider you.
that was segregation.
Oh yeah, that was segregation. Yeah, that was happening up until just a couple of years ago in the south in Ireland. I'm not sure about the north. So
Good.
desegregated us. Desegregated us. They actually gave us like colouring books and stuff that we would have done in junior infants. We would have
That's
used in junior infants.
that's tremendous. That's outlandish. Good
Yeah,
God.
yeah. Well, look, it is what it is. But myself and brother Joe did really well academically. So when they were giving us these colouring books, we were like, "What's this all about?" A Huggy Bear. Then they were giving us. So we were actually in shock. But we said nothing for a couple of weeks because I suppose as kids are going, I get to play with all my cousins and all this, and we get the mess and whatever. But after a couple of weeks, David, I'll be honest, myself and people and Joe were just academically not challenged, and we needed to be challenged. We just had those brains. So we went and told my mother about this, and my mother was enraged. And she went over to the principal of the school and she gave him some stick. And she said, "Take my children out of that class, put them back in with the class they were meant to be in the general population." Now, my boys are smart enough for that and whatever. So we ended up, I think it might have been 2 weeks or a month, hard to remember now as a kid, but we ended up back in our original class that we were meant to progress in third class. And yeah, I suppose it was kind of a rough kind of place I grew up in, David. There was probably 5, 6 traveller sites all in a row in kind of a half a mile run down a lane. And then across the road was Darndale and Belcamp, two very rough working class areas. And to be honest, we had to fight our way to school, to kind of pass by all the sites. Even we'd be fighting nearly every morning and coming back and fighting settled kids and getting bullied. And among our own people with traveller kids, because we'd no father, we were seen as kind of less than, and we'd get in a lot of fights and stuff, and sometimes get beaten really bad. So after like a few years of this, and a lot of stress on my mother when she'd see the kind of the black eyes and all that stuff, I ended up joining boxing. And when I joined boxing, within 6 months, I won a Dublin title, a Leinster title, a leagues title, and an All Ireland title. And I was the first Irish champion in the club in like 5 years, 6 years. And I did the same the next year, and I went to the Four Nations, and I lost in the final against the Welshman. I did the same the next year, and I won against the Englishman, and knocked him out, and was very proud and all that. And came back home. My brother said I should have been fighting for Great Britain because I was born in London. So that was up. That takes me up until around 15, and around that time, then I had a lot of vengeance in me, and a lot of pride, and a lot of ego. And I looked back at my childhood, and a lot of the people who bullied me, who were a lot older than me, I wanted to get them back. And there was a particular fella who bullied me when I was a kid. And now I was 15 and I thought I was a man. He was 21 or 2 maybe. So I fought him in a bare knuckle fight, which was a part of a feud. And there was a lot of fear around all that. I was given like a shotgun in my hand at 13 years of age, by uncles of mine, to get rid of it and hide it or whatever. And I ended up actually blowing the trailer bedroom wall off because they told me there was no bullets in it, and I thought it was John Wayne at the time, and it was like, there's no bullets, I can play around when I was a kid. And it blew the whole thing apart, and the guards actually scattered, they were so afraid. So a lot of chaos, there was a lot of violence, and I got chased by men with weapons, and I got, Bell's palsy in my jaw, which was like a facial stroke. I got that twice from being involved in these feuds as a kid, and everything got worse and worse and worse in my mid-teens, my late teens. And my mother then went with this Englishman of Irish heritage. She got engaged to him, and he seemed all right, although I always detected something from him that I didn't like. I couldn't point my finger at it, and I always had kind of good instincts for that, but I thought this may be my own bias. So one day, it was 2007, Mother's Day, I went in to give me mother's a present and some money for Mother's Day. I was 17, and there was blood all over her bed. And I called her, and she was up in my aunt's. So I went up there, and she was battered and bruised and in a really, really bad state. it turned out the night before that he had beaten her, threw her down the stairs, and dragged her through a puddle in a car park, and left her there to nearly die, and then had the cheek to come back to the house and sleep with her that night in the house. So that really took my whole world down, and I was very much in a world of violence that time, David. So I handled that whole incident with the violence, but the kind of guilt of not protecting my mother was something that really lived with me. And it was a couple of years of self-destruction then, and I was involved in crime in my late teens, and my mother found out one day, and she asked me to stop what I was doing, and I agreed to stop, and I stopped. And when I stopped, I got into a kind of deeper depression, got a big weight gain. I think I gained about 8 stone in a year and a half or something, because I quit boxing and stopped being fit. And during that time, I just watched a lot of films, and over and over, all I would do was spend like my dole money on DVDs and the cinema, and I would just watch any film in the cinema. But I really fell in love with The Sopranos, and I used to make a lasagna and pizza, and maybe get a bottle of wine, and just watch The Sopranos on repeat. And I just thought it was the best thing ever. And I thought James Gandolfini's performance was the best ever. So one day, my brother Joe came into my room because I was getting worse and worse with my mental health. And I decided to kill myself. And in that moment, my brother Joe knocked on the door, walked in and said, "Are you going to kill yourself?" And I said, "No," but I gave him a hint that I would. And he said, "Please don't do that, because we can't afford to bury you." And so we laughed, and he said, "Look, why don't you try something? Why don't you try acting?" And it was like a light bulb moment. So I researched acting classes, Dublin, and the Abbey School of Music and Drama came up. And I ended up doing a course there. I borrowed money from my uncle and my brother, and somebody had a dole and €5 from my mother for the bus in and out of town. And I did the acting class, and in the acting class, there was this kind of upper class Dublin lad who was being discriminatory towards this black Brazilian man. And I volunteered to do an improvisation with the Dublin fella. In the improvisation, I kind of got hands on him and got a bit intense. It got broken up, and I left the room, and I thought I kind of went too far. But the acting teacher followed me and chased me down the street and asked me to come back, and said that I had real talent, but just don't go that far again. And she was happy to work with me, and she did. And I just fell in love with acting. It was like a new world, creativity. I'd never experienced it before. So it was so much different than athleticism and all that stuff that I liked, and you got a buzz out of, but it was something cathartic, I suppose, is the word. And then that's, I suppose, from that moment, and like throughout my life, I suppose, in and out of faith, David, like as a kid going to mass for prolonged periods, months, maybe a couple of years, then in and out of it. And then in my teens, I went back into it, mid-teens. And then when I stopped, it's funny, like whenever I stopped going to mass, stopped praying, if coincidentally, or as we know, there's no coincidences, David, that's when the darkness set in. And now I see that, and I see the pattern of my life, And once I decided to be an actor, and I was going to do something positive, funny enough, good stuff started happening. And I got cast the lead role in the film King of the Travers, then another one called Stalker with Barry Keoghan, which I co-wrote with the director, and then I did a few other things, and then Love Hate, and then all this other stuff. And it was all great, and it was a journey, and it was exciting. But I looked at creativity and acting and writing and all that stuff. I looked at it like a healer, like it was going to heal me. The thing is, creativity is a good plaster, but that's all it is. And it'll stop the blood from gushing for a time being, but it'll eventually fall off, and the wound will never heal. That's what I believe now. And I suppose my whole 20s was me figuring that out and falling over and over again. And I suppose just pursuing things of the world, David, really, and thinking these things are going to make you happy. And I suppose also I was running away from my father's suicide and the grief and the bullying and all the stuff that came from that. I didn't acknowledge that was creating like a war inside me, and it was the impulse behind all my self-destructive behaviors.
And John, what did your self-destructive behavior consist of? Would you Would you amplify that a little bit?
Oh yeah, like drinking and going on benders and smoking cigarettes excessively, and also eating. Eating has been a major self-destructive behavior of mine. Just eating for comfort, you know. So that kind of stuff, you know. And I like it, if I'm being honest, you know, um, this stuff was really worrying for people around me, you know, particularly my poor mother, you know, who I didn't want to put stress on, who I loved more than anybody, but of course it was, because sometimes I would disappear for a few days, and she wouldn't know where I was, you know, and I wouldn't answer the phone, or my phone was dead, or whatever it may be, and I was searching for something. I was searching for a few different things. I was obviously searching for healing, but also just wanting to escape and ignore. But the thing is, the further you go down that path, the harder it is to ignore actually what you're running away from, and actually it comes at you harder and louder. I always say about, you know, in terms of anxiety, depression, and your mental health, and that I always say that that voice that we all have, David, that self-destructive voice, and that imposter syndrome voice, that negative voice, the volume of that voice is going to depend on how you are treating yourself, how you are caring for yourself, and if you're doing all the right things, you know, it'll probably only be a whisper. But if you're doing all the bad things, it's going to be shouting at you, you know, and that's really what it was. I suppose it progressively got worse, and I'd have ups and downs and periods of good times, but ultimately, you know, all the things that you would try to help, you know, as alluded to earlier, the health stuff, you know, the walks, the sea swim, the stuff that you're advised to do, ultimately do work for a short period of time, but they never heal you. So I started to get into more sort of creative endeavors and writing more and directing more and doing theater, and again chasing the kind of creative cathartic buzz. And COVID was a tough time for me. When COVID hit, I thought it was the end of the world. I was convinced of it, and it was a kind of perfect storm for me, David, because it was I was 30 on January 5th, 2020, and I had always this self-fulfilling prophecy that I was never going to make it to 31 because my father died at 30. So I had this in my head my whole life, and I never shared it to anybody. And when I hit 30 on January 5th, 2020, it was a ticking time bomb. And I started to completely and utterly unravel. Like from that moment, it was just this psychological construct that I constructed in my head or my own conscious bit. And from that moment, I got really, really poor. My mental health was the worst it had been since that moment I had at 20 years of age, 10 years before, when I found acting. That's when it really hit along. And then to make things worse, there's this thing called COVID came along, and this pandemic, and you're seeing images of people dying. And my biggest fear was that my mother would get it and that she would die because she was a heavy smoker. She had a bad cough all her life, and that she was overweight and not very healthy and whatever. And I turned into like a maniac during that time and was like riddled with anxiety and very, very manic. And my mother was worried about me, and my family too, going, "What's wrong with him? He's losing his mind," you know. And then I eventually chilled in the whole COVID thing, but it just brought about self-destructive behaviors and you know, just stupid stuff online and political and all that garbage. And I ended up going down to that dark place again because there was a particular political incident I was involved in, and I was, you know, people portrayed me as a bad person and a this and a that online, and I took it in. And I was very susceptible to what people said online at that time because I had so much anxiety and fear just about everything, you know, like even in the middle of all the kind of bad stuff in my life and the violence and the fighting and all that, I would, you know, people would have thought I was a tough guy or whatever, you know, but really I was always riddled in fear, always, you know. And my whole life was actually just being afraid, but being so afraid, I'd rather run at the thing that I'm afraid of. So in turn, it was sort of a self-destructive thing, dealing with fear, you know, if I'm making sense there. So all that COVID stuff, and then come out the other side of that, and I ended up making a film, David, called The Black Guelph. Right now, The Black Guelph is about a father and son story. I directed this film, and the background to the father, the character of the father, is that he went to an industrial school, okay, that was run by the by the church, by the clergy, by the Christian Brothers.
Well, that's it for today. I look forward to have you back again next Monday on Faith Matters at 8:30 on Southeast Radio. So God bless you, John.
God bless you, David.
I look forward to having you with me then next Monday, 8:30. Don't miss it. Take care now, and God bless. If you would like to share this or any of our previous programs, you will find them on the audio podcast Finding Happiness on drbhennessy.com, YouTube Music, YouTube, and Spotify. I'm looking forward to having you back with me again next week at the same time. But for now, good night and God bless.